This is PatZi with a Z. Welcome to Joy on Paper Live, a program for writers and those who dream of writing. And my name is PatZi, and I am so happy to welcome today somebody who has been a guest on Joy on Paper, the radio program, many times, and it is first time here on YouTube. And his name is Tim McGee. Hi, Tim.
Hi, Patsy. How are you?
Great. It's been so wonderful over the years. You've been on the radio program for one of my favorite books. And I remember when I got it and I said, oh, wow, this is like a dream book come true. Because, first of all, it starts in Michigan. And being a Michigander, and then discovering, of course, that you also, like I do, follow the Detroit Tigers. And we
It's
had a
good
great
year.
year with the Detroit Lions, right?
Yes, we did. Ended
So
too soon, but
that's it. So I, right there, the minute I realized where the book was, where Worthy McGuire is the name of your first book. Worthy McGuire
mhm.
just stole my heart. I love him so much. And I was so thrilled. Now, quite a few years later, a little bit later, you come out with a new book. And it is really, this is a clever idea what you've done. It's Worthy McGuire, Worthy's Legacy, and it's volume one. And Worthy's
Mhm.
legacy it's exactly what Worthy McGuire deserved, a legacy.
Thank you. It was a long time coming.
It was, but it was worth waiting for because it's a fascinating story and you have to tell us about it. I just let's start talking a little bit about it and then I'm going to show everybody a map because this is explain first of all Worthy and then we'll go on and describe the new book.
Worthy McGuire was I wrote that book as a kind of to honor the greatest generation. And my father was part of that greatest generation. And I wanted to put together something that would honor them. And so it's about a World War II vet who very late in his life decides to fulfill a promise that he made during the war, and he's in his late 80s at the time, so he has to think about going back to where he made that promise in France. And the only way he can really make that trip now is to engage his family because he really can't make the trip on his own. So he goes and talks to his family, and it's a bit of a dysfunctional family. So he makes the trip back and is able to fulfill that promise. And it's a story of kind of family dynamics, and it's actually a story of redemption as well about how Worthy, on without planning it, has a chance to redeem what he's had happened with his family. And in the end, it's about the power of the importance of family. So when I finished Worthy, I think one of the first questions I got from some of the readers were, what happens to the family after they return from their trip to France? And initially, I was thinking about putting together it was going to be one book, and I wanted to explore some of the issues around what happened to Worthy in the immediate days following the D-Day invasion. And I initially was going to write one book and the first kind of section of that book was going to take place in the immediate aftermath of the D-Day invasion in Normandy. And as I was researching and thinking about it and kind of working out what the storyline would be, I realized that I had a separate story here. I thought was a really good story to tell about what happens to Worthy and how he has an impact on a young German soldier who he captures in France. And the story is really about that soldier's journey from France to a prisoner of war camp in South Wales, and then his interactions with a Welsh family. And then so that book is almost a standalone. And then the final volume, which I've also finished, ties Worthy's Legacy Volume 1 back into the McGuire family and the post time after their trip to France. I hope that doesn't sound too convoluted, but that was initially it was going to be one book, and then I split it into two when I realized I had a really good story here.
Not at all, because what I want to show people here, this is the POW camp on Island Farm, which we're going to land up in, Bridgend, Wales. But before that, for people who don't know, and unfortunately we have a lot of people who don't know about World War II and what D-Day means.
Right, and demarcation day, I believe, is the term, but it was the invasion of France by the Allies, and the it was when I was thinking about it when I first went over to France, thinking about this story, the tales I heard, the stories I heard around that invasion were just they were incredible in terms of stuff that you didn't expect, and that was the impetus of using the D-Day invasion. And then I started doing research around the battle for Normandy, the battle for France after, and it was a pretty brutal battle. And one of the things that came out of it, which was surprising to me, was when the Allies broke out of Omaha or out of the beaches and into to Normandy, the fighting was intense. What they didn't expect was all of the prisoners of war that they captured immediately, and they really had a problem with trying to figure out what to do with them. And that was I became interested in that component of it, and that's really how Worthy's legacy was born. Was you have all of these prisoners of war where some of them were sent to as far away as like Canada and the United States, and many of them were sent to England and Wales.
In fact, there were quite a few prisoner of war camps right here in Texas.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
they were all over.
they were all over. My dad was in D-Day, so this book really meant a lot to me the minute I read it, and I love your character, Worthy. And it's really one of my favorite D-Day books because I always love to read about D-Day just to honor my father, and you blended so much humor. Worthy McGuire has so much humor. Let's say we have a dysfunctional family that has a lot of lessons to learn.
Yeah, it was. I'm sure writers get this all the time. I have people ask me like, "Are these based on real people?" And Worthy was, but the rest of the family was an amalgamation of people I've run into across the years. But so the moving to Worthy's legacy, the story was I wanted to explore kind of what happened to these POWs, and it was just I want to call it dumb luck, but my wife has a cousin who lives just outside of Cardiff in Wales. And I asked her, I said, I'd read it and had seen that there was POWs that were in the United Kingdom. And I said, were there any camps near you in Cardiff? And she said, yeah, there happened to be one called Island Farm Camp, and it was only about a 10-minute drive from her house. And just armed with the name, I Googled it and I did a lot of research and came up with this was a very interesting camp. It was initially built as a housing for munitions workers. It was pretty evident war was going to be coming to England in the late 1930s. They started arming and they built a large munitions camp or factory just out of Cardiff, and they built this and they figured that it was going to be mostly women who were going to be working in there, and so they built this camp assuming that the women would not want to travel back and forth from home to the factory. So they thought, here's a convenient place for them to stay. And it turns out that none of the women wanted to stay there. So they had built this place and then nobody came. Then later in the war, when the Americans came in and they were training for D-Day, they turned it into it became a camp for the Americans where they stayed prior to the invasion. And then when they left, it sat empty again. But then fairly quickly, they turned it into this prison camp. And one of the things they were initially trying to do was they were trying to sort out the prisoner types when they were catching. So if there was they were categorizing like the hardened Nazis, they were categorized as like a say like a letter A, and they tried to group them together in camps because they didn't want them infecting the rest of the prison population. But the reality is that didn't last very long. And in this camp, Island Farm Camp, initially was supposed to be this like hardened prisoner camp, but turned out that it ended up being they had a mix of soldiers and prisoners coming in there. And then what you're looking at on that is the sole remaining barracks that was on in the camp, and there's actually a gentleman who maintains that, and he was hoping to turn it into a museum. And I quite frankly, I'm not sure where he's at, but he and I communicated via email while I was researching it, and it's a very interesting setup because again, initially we think it was for these women, and then it became a prisoner of war camp, and they built fencing around it with the barbed wire and the search towers and the whole thing. And one of the things I learned, and I don't want to give too much of the story away, but there was a prison breakout late in the war, and they called it the German Great Escape. If you think about that movie in the 1960s, The Great Escape, Steve McQueen was in it, and the German did have an escape, and they figured there were about 80 to 85 prisoners who actually broke out of the camp. And when I learned that and I was researching that, I was like, I can use this in the book.
Yeah, this is something like a dream come true for an author. You find something really historic that nobody else
Oh,
has written about.
it
It's
was
exciting.
yeah, it was amazing. There was some very good books written on it in terms of the facts of it. And again, the stories of some of these guys who they break out of this prison and they have no idea what they're going to do. And they're just like, a couple of them were just like, let's just, yeah, I'll go out until I get captured and then I'll come back in. But some of them were naval prisoners. And so they thought, we'll go steal a boat and go back and fight the war. So others were Air Force and same thing, we'll go steal a plane. So there was also a whole mix of people that broke out, and it became obviously at the time in Wales big news when this breakout occurred. But I'm
Well,
able to use that and
it was like a dream come true. Really, something finding something like that is just. I got such a kick out of it. I thought, oh wow. Now, of course, I used to own a store in Cardiff, so
did you?
I've been to the area. Now, I'd never visited this POW camp, but my father also was in D-Day, and he was at one point somewhere north of Cardiff preparing for D-Day. So I'm familiar with the area. Beautiful area, isn't it?
It really is a beautiful area. It's we go there almost every year on vacation, and very green. It rains a lot, but it is, and the people are just they're just wonderful people. And that was one of the things that I got out of this was the stories about the POWs, how they were treated initially. One of the interesting things that happened near the end of the war was when the war ended in Europe, and they were trying to figure out what do you do with these all of these POWs, and they had been going out on like work duty during the war. They were going out and doing things like repairing roads or repairing barns and farms and things like that. But then they were like, what do we do with them now the war is over? And they ended up like keeping them around, and or they many of them stayed around and became like employees, farm laborers. They got jobs, and for the most part, the Welsh people just they accepted them. In many cases, I read where there was marriages happened and things like that. So it was, if you think about the kind of the grace that people can show each other after such a horrific event, it's pretty impressive.
Really, quite a few of the ones who were here in Texas, not only did they didn't want to go back, they wanted to stay, and many marriages occurred. And we still have in places a little south of the, I'm in Austin, but it was a little further south where the camps were. There are a lot of like German restaurants and German bakeries, and those are
Yeah,
all.
Yeah, I have a cousin who lives in Austin, and I think it's like Fredericksburg or something like that. That it's
Yeah,
just south of Austin. He said there's a strong German population there.
yeah.
So anyway, I guess the interesting thing about the character, his name is Karl Hamann, and he is a. It's the end of the war. He has been able to avoid being drafted, and I don't want to give too much of the story away, but he ends up being drafted at the end of the war as he's an auto mechanic. He's actually very good auto mechanic, and he ends up in Normandy. And one day he's fixing cars and tanks and trucks, and then the next day when the Allies have landed and broken out, he's handed a rifle and said now he's part of a parachute squad and he's sent off to fight. And he's reluctant. He's not a supporter of Hitler. His mother is American, so he has deep roots. He can speak English because his mother wanted him to learn the language, and so that has actually becomes a very important tool for him later on in the story. But it's really the story of how he really wants to survive because he has a wife and daughter who he's never met. She was born after he was drafted, and it's really a story about he just wants to get home. He wants to get home to his family and be done war.
And then he
So
meets Worthy.
and he meets Worthy in a very
Well, we don't have to give too much away, but he does meet Worthy,
yeah
which is a great encounter in itself.
yeah they have an encounter, and it really affects Karl for the rest of his life.
Yeah, it
And
does.
it's a pause where you're even though you're wearing a different uniform, it's a pause where there are these two human beings who are they're both sick of war. They're sick of everything that's going on and find this brief connection. And then while he is basically transported to Wales, and while he's there, he has another encounter with a local Welsh family, which are probably just about as dysfunctional as the McGuire family. He has this encounter with them, and a lot of kind of what happens in that encounter will play into volume two when we meet up with McGuire's in the present day. A lot of what happens in the rest of the Worthy's volume, his legacy volume one, will have a direct impact on volume two.
Well, for a book like this, and you're very lucky you had somebody in Cardiff, and you had this just works out so perfectly. But tell us some of your research that you had to do because it's fascinating, isn't it, to do this kind of research?
It was a there was there's a lot been written on it in terms of the POWs and how they were captured. And it was a kind of a strange thing where you had soldiers who were like Karl Hamann, they were drafted. They were there because they really had no choice. And then you had the flip side of that was the fanatics who were never willing to give up, and they were thrown together. And a lot of my research was trying to sort out kind of how the Allies responded. Like I said, they did try to categorize them and they did try to separate them, but it became so overwhelming. There was a lot of written about how when the Germans were captured at the end of the war, they did not want to be captured by the Russians. They would much rather have been
Ugh.
captured by
Nobody wants to be captured by the Russians.
yeah, that's actually a good point. Yeah, but because they knew if they went east, if they went to Russia, there's a good chance that they would die and not die honorably. But they knew if they went west, if they went to the Allied side, that's what I read was they knew they would be treated humanely, and that's where they wanted to go. There's actually when I was over there, we took a trip to this island farm camp, and literally it's one barrack building. That's all that remains. And the gentleman who runs it, who ran at the time, I believe he's still doing it. He opens it up like once a year, and he has the barracks so that people can go in and walk around and get a sense of it. But like I said, he was hoping to make it more of a museum. But it was interesting because he has a lot of stories. So I was able to go through his website and read a lot of the stories about the prisoners that were there and what they did. to pass the time during the day. And it was one of the things I read was for the Germans, and it didn't matter if you were a fanatic or just a regular soldier. Kind of one of their most important tenets was to they kept a very neat camp, and it was a point of pride for them. And they all worked toward keeping those camps neat, even in their endeavors to dig tunnels and try to escape. They were very precise in how they went about it. So I found that was it was interesting. And but there was, like I said, the stories that I read about the breakout were very interesting because both sides were. It wasn't like the Germans didn't want to break out. They wanted to break out, but they didn't want to hurt anybody, if that makes sense. They hopefully could they get home, but they didn't want to. They wanted to do it in a humane way, and I think part of that, to me, was their interactions with the Welsh people, and they felt like they were um, good hosts.
Tell me, after spending some time in Wales, do you speak Welsh now?
I do
It's
not, and
it's so
um,
difficult.
each word is about
I
that
know.
long,
It's
and there's tons of consonants and not many vowels.
exactly. Oh, it was so funny.
But it's a beautiful language, and one of the things that my wife is part Welsh. That's how we ended up going over there when we first married. Anybody who is looking for a place to go and vacation to just see spectacular scenery, I would tell them to go to the Gower Peninsula because it's just unbelievable. Like a huge national park, and it ends up the Gower ends up to be a significant part of Worthy's Legacy Volume 2. But one of the things I was going to say is that they have beautiful voices. And I don't know if you remember Tom Jones.
Oh yes.
He's from, I believe he's from either Cardiff or Swansea, and he's still around.
I
But
think so. Yeah. And many fine actors are from Wales because
yeah,
they're a performative people.
they are.
It doesn't take much. Any pub, go to any pub.
Yeah, the one thing I learned was the poet Dylan Thomas was from the little city of Mumbles, which is where we spent a lot of our time vacationing. It's a little seaside tourist or port or town. It's very nice. Catherine Zeta-Jones, the actress, is also from the Mumbles. So you're right. Yeah, they're very good performers.
Yeah, usually in a pub in Wales, you will have one person who can get up. All you have to do is offer offer to pay for a pint, and
Yeah,
there will be somebody who can get up and start reciting Dylan Thomas like crazy.
yeah,
So,
yeah. And it was the one thing I noticed in terms of when my father-in-law passed away. He was also in the war. He was a mountain rescue in Wales. So what happened was he was a doctor, and they what he had to do was when oftentimes planes coming back from bombing missions or training missions would crash in the mountains just north of Cardiff, and it was his job to go up and try and rescue or recover. And when he passed away, there was just this beautiful ceremony. As I told my nephews, I said, uh, they certainly know how to bury people well. And the music was impressive as well.
there are so many reasons. This book, and of course, Worthy McGuire, which I think is just superb. It Everybody who has any relative who was in D-Day has to read it because it just it tells a story without all the horror. We know bad things happen, but at the same time, Worthy is so worthy. He's worthy of notice, and he's great. And of course, being a Michigander, I'm particularly partial to him. And I think of you whenever I'm like watching the Tigers or the Lions, or I think of Holland, Michigan, because you went to school in Holland, right?
I did. Yes, I did.
And Detroit. I love to think of Detroit because people don't. I will talk about Detroit, and people will say Detroit, Detroit, and I say, "Oh my gosh, it was so great! It was so wonderful, and I loved it so much as a child growing up there. It was fantastic."
Yeah, it was a very unique. I still have strong ties. I'm actually working on a story now that the main characters grew up in Michigan, and they will end up in I'm in Maine now, but they will end up in Maine. But the strong ties are there. I can't, I don't want to break those ties. No
No,
strong
there's
ties at all.
something there's and of course being a Tigers fan is being a Tigers fan. When I was in Europe, whenever I saw an American, I said, "What's happening with the Tigers?"
I was out walking this spring here in Maine, or it was probably late May, but I had a Tigers hat on, and I had a guy stop at a stoplight, roll his windows down, and say, "It's a good year for him, isn't it?" And so far,
Yeah, no, I wear my Tigers hat too.
yeah,
Of course, it was even more with the Lions.
yeah, we suffered so long.
Oh, so long. Oh, so long. But it's been good, and it's going to get better. She's got the right handle on the team, so
Yeah,
yeah, we can be very proud of Detroit. Both of your books are just wonderful. I think, as always, you're just a natural writer. But tell people when you decided to write, you were a business person. Many people will say, "Oh, I dream of writing, I dream of writing," and then they don't do anything. So, what was the impetus that you said, "Okay, that's it. I'm going to get this worthy book out of me"?
I'm an avid reader, and I got into my late 40s and early 50s, and was thinking about the whole writing process. And it's funny because I do a lot of reading and I read a lot of really great books, and then some not so great. And I thought I wanted to, with Worthy, I was like, I wanted to write this story that honors the greatest generation. And that was a term, when I was first thinking about it, that was the term that Tom Brokaw had coined. And it really did explain a lot about what our parents went through. And it was very different. And I had read some World War II novels, and also had started reading some Stephen Ambrose about the D-Day invasion. And I just decided I really wanted to put together the story. And like any other, every writer probably has a different process. But I started off with the end in sight. I knew where I wanted this to finish, and now I was like, okay, how do I get there? And I had a lot of different iterations. I had a lot of different dead ends that I had to take a right hand turn or a left hand turn to keep things going. But it just, I think when I write, I so far when I've written a book, I'm writing it for a specific person. I wrote Worthy McGuire for my parents, for my father, for the guy who is the role model I used for Worthy. Was a good friend of my father's who was actually in the Canadian Air Force. But he and my father were colleagues. They were both physicians, and he grew up as my Uncle Jim. And he was the inspiration mostly for Worthy, that kind of acerbic, sarcastic curmudgeon. And then when I've written some in my other books, Seasons, I they're written for a specific person. And my stories, I tell my kids all the time, when I say, when I'm gone and you're going to try and remember me and figure out what was that guy thinking, I tell them, just read my stories. These are written for, and they express how I feel. And not a lot of it doesn't have to be biographical, but I want to tell a certain story to someone. And when I'm writing a story, I have a specific person in mind.
You write beautifully, and both books are great. And let's just, I know you have a web page, so we'll tell people about that.
Thank
It's
you.
tim-mcgee-author.com. And, and do you do anything else? Are you doing social media?
Yeah, it's actually working with someone right now to recharge the Facebook, and also I'm on Instagram, and so gonna in honor of the Fourth of July, I'm gonna run a discount for the paperback for Worthy's Legacy as well as Worthy McGuire, and that'll kick in a couple of days probably.
Mention, if you want, the illustrator for the covers because she's done a great job.
She has. Daniela Mellon is a friend of mine who I had the pleasure of meeting in Florida, and I didn't know I knew she was a very talented writer and artist. And then when I reached out to her to redo the Worthy McGuire cover based on your recommendation, PatZi,
Yeah, I did. I did push you.
yeah, She did a great job with it, and I was very pleased. And I reached out to her in, I don't know, about a year and a half ago when I had finished Worthy's Legacy, and she had a couple of health issues that she had to get around, but then she was able to do the cover. It's a very similar look and feel, I think, to Worthy McGuire as Worthy's Legacy. And like Worthy McGuire, the cover tells you a little bit about what's going on in the story.
Yeah,
So,
with the Welsh dragon.
Welsh Dragon. And she's just finished the second cover for Worthy's Legacy Volume 2. So I'll be working on that soon as well.
Okay. Tim McGee, I think you're fantastic. I love both books and just great reads. It's summertime and perfect time to be reading, right?
Very much, yes.
Okay. Again, Tim, thank you so much for joining me here on Joy on Paper Live. It's nice now that even though we're far away from each other, it's nice that now we can still see each other, okay?
It is. Thank you very much, PatZi.
But thank you very much, Tim. Really fantastic. Tim McGee, and the new book is Worthy's Legacy, Volume 1. Get it now and get it while it's on special, everybody. Thank you again, Tim. Thank you so much for being a guest on Joy on Paper Live.
Thank you.
Worthy's Legacy, Volume 1 by Tim McGee is a sequel to Worthy McGuire, the story of an elderly American vet who returns to Normandy to keep a promise. In this new release, we read about a young, reluctant German soldier who was captured by Worthy and sent to a POW camp in England. Karl Hamann was destined to spend the final days of the war behind a barbed wire fence in South Wales. Or was he? During the biggest prisoner escape of POWs in British history, Karl must make a choice. You will enjoy this exciting book. Available on Amazon.